Well, the general consensus is that Malcolm Turnbull will dismiss calls for a secret ballot on this issue in the party room, and that he will win majority support for any deal that is struck with the government. But it will leave the party room divided, and even those who want to strike a deal with the government on an emissions trading scheme have been privately critical of how Malcolm Turnbull has dealt with this issue. For that reason, some expect a leadership spill could even be moved in tomorrow's party room meeting, and the person that some in the Liberal Party are pointing to as they expect to move that spill motion is the former Howard Government Minister, Kevin Andrews, and he joins me now. Kevin Andrews, thank you for your time.
Good afternoon, David.
Will you be moving a leadership spill tomorrow?
Look, at this stage, tomorrow's party room meeting is about the ETS legislation. That's what's the main item on the agenda, and that's what we all want to discuss. It's unfortunate that we're doing it so late in the parliamentary year, giving us very little time to consider, on behalf of our constituents and the people of Australia, what's in the best long-term interest for this nation.
You said at this stage the party room meeting is about the ETS, but if you don't get your way on that, is there a prospect that you could call for a spill of the leadership?
Well, that's not an intention at this stage, David. What we're on about is the ETS and that legislation. Now, I know the media like to play this game of rule in or rule out that. I'm not playing that game. I'm simply answering you that tomorrow the party room meeting is about the ETS, and that's what I presume all my colleagues will be going along to discuss.
Have you been satisfied with the way Malcolm Turnbull has handled this issue, though?
Look, it's been a very difficult issue for the coalition. There's no doubt about that. Everybody knows that there's been a range of views which have been discussed about it, and that's appropriate in a party which represents a spectrum of ideas. Also, I think, an indication of frustration that the government's legislative process has been such that here we are talking less than 24 hours away from this is to be presented, and I've got no idea whatsoever of what's in this package.
But it was Ian Macfarlane, your coalition frontbencher, your negotiator, who asked the government to put the offer to the coalition on Tuesday morning, tomorrow morning.
Look, I'm not talking about whether it's today or tomorrow, David. I'm saying here we are in the last sitting week of this parliamentary year. Here we are less than 3 days away from the end of the parliamentary year. You don't know what's in the legislation, I don't know what's in the legislation, and yet I'm expected on behalf of my constituents and the Australian people to make a decision about what I think is probably the most profound piece of legislation in terms of its impact for this country.
Is it possible for you to do that, to make a decision in that tighter time frame?
Well, that's why when we go back to the principles that we set down in July, we said, amongst other things, we should be waiting for the Copenhagen talks to see what comes out of that. We also said we should be waiting to see what the Americans do. Now, I was in Washington last week, and I can tell you that there is absolutely no political appetite in Washington to discuss this at the moment. They've put it off to spring, that is next autumn in Australian time, but the reality is it's a congressional election year next year, and the likelihood of that appetite diminishing ever further is there.
Still, your leader will want a decision on this from the party room tomorrow within the 4-hour meeting that is scheduled. Do you think that is possible?
Well, we'll just have to see where the debate goes. I mean, I can only speak about what I can see in the legislation now. We voted against it in the House last week. It was voted against when it went to the Senate the previous time. And as I said, I don't know what's going to be presented tomorrow, and nor do any of my colleagues. And if there is some frustration, then let that be an indication of frustration on the part of many people in Australia who are concerned about it. I mean, there was a poll over the weekend by the Galaxy organisation which said that the majority of people thought that electricity prices would go up, jobs would be affected, and a majority wanted it delayed until after Copenhagen.
3 weeks ago, John Howard told the Sunday Telegraph, quote, "With the emissions trading scheme, what Mr Rudd is proposing is not all that different from what I took to the last election," end quote. You were a senior minister of the Howard government. If it was good enough to support John Howard's emissions trading scheme then, if it's not all that different, why isn't it good enough to support Kevin Rudd's now?
When circumstances change, one ought to look at things again.
So
now,
what's
the reality
changed?
is, well, the reality number one is that what John Howard was a set of principles. It wasn't spelt out in the detail of it to what extent we have now. Secondly, we've had a global financial crisis, which, whilst Australia has done better than most nations, nonetheless, this is having a major impact around the world. And thirdly, we've taken, I think, the sensible decision of saying, let's see what the rest of the world does. I mean, if this is going to be a huge tax impost on Australians, which it will be, then we ought not be disadvantaging jobs or the economy of Australia in the process. Now, we don't know that at the moment. We don't know what the rest of the world is going to do, and we ought to be waiting.
What is your read on the party room? Do you think they will support a deal if it's recommended by Malcolm Turnbull?
Look, I don't know. I think there will be a very substantial debate, and there ought to be a very substantial debate on this issue because, as I said, this is going to affect not just us in the next few years, it's going to affect us in Australia for decades and for generations to come. It deserves a very serious debate.
But are you open to, personally, to supporting a deal if it's recommended by the leader?
I will look at what the proposals are, but as I've said to you, I've got no idea what they are at the moment, David, so that places me and my colleagues in a very difficult position.
And are you prepared to cross the floor if the party room decides to support a deal and you personally don't support?
Look,
is that something you would consider?
I'm not going to sort of answer hypotheticals because I don't know. I don't know what the proposition is that we're going to be asked to look at. I don't even know what the recommendation is. I mean, it could well be that the recommendation tomorrow morning is that we reject this. I don't know what it is, so we're entirely in the dark.
How much of this is a leadership issue?
I don't think this is really about a leadership issue at all. It's about what's in the best term interests of Australia. As I said, I can't think of any other piece of legislation that's going to have such a profound and significant impact on the economy of this country as this does. The GST legislation pales into insignificance compared to what we're discussing now, and that was the subject of much more community and indeed parliamentary debate than we've had on the ETS.
And it has been reported that you are prepared to put your hand up for the leadership as a way of resolving this and resolving the concerns over Malcolm Turnbull's handling of it. Is that correct? You've canvassed colleagues about that?
I haven't been canvassing colleagues. No, I haven't. And all I'll say about the leadership is the general principle, and that is that the leadership is the gift of the Parliamentary Liberal Party. At the moment, we have a leader. I'm a loyal servant of the people of Australia, hopefully, and my party, and I'll do whatever job people regard as appropriate for me to do.
So if you're asked to put your hand up and take over the leadership, you would be prepared to do that?
I'm not saying anything more than that, David. That's a principle. As I said, it's the game which you're engaged in, and I understand that of ruling in or ruling out this. I'm not going to engage in that game.
Can you say this? Have others in the party suggested this to you? Have they asked you whether you're prepared to stand?
Look, there's lots of discussions go on in the party, and they'll remain confidential.
But clearly some are unhappy with how Malcolm Turnbull has handled this.
People are frustrated about this process, and they're frustrated for good reason, as I am, and that is that I have got no idea what I'm being asked to vote on sometime in the next 2 or 3 days. And I'm being asked in decent period of time to look at this, to look at the consequences, to try and think about what are the unintended consequences for Australia into the future. Because once this is in place, there will be no undoing of it. It'll be there forever, and we'll be living with it and paying for it for years and decades to come.
And will the inevitable divisions, whichever way this goes, within the coalition remain? Can the coalition continue to operate functionally in the lead up to next year's election?
Look, there's been some untidiness in the coalition. That's a matter of fact. We all know that. What I believe that I and all of my colleagues are concerned about is that we are unified and that we can go forward to the next election. I've been doing a lot of work, for example, on policy over the last 12 months so that we can go to the next election with a set of policies that we can take to the Australian people and they will regard appropriately.
Kevin Andrews, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, David.
And stay with us after the break. Our panel, Graham Morris and Bruce Hawker. Don't go away.